Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Chapter 2 of our Hitchalong 2019, a read-along of Christopher Hitchens' best-selling book, God Is Not Great, that I'm doing with David Murphy. And I'll leave a link to his channel down below. We're doing a chapter a day on weekdays. We're giving you the weekends to rest, and we're just going to do that until we run out of book. And we've done this with very little in the way of advanced planning. So watching his first video yesterday was a treat for me. I had no idea which things he would alight on, which specifics he would make. And in the course of his video yesterday, I'll leave a link to it down below. In the course of his video, he struck on two notes. It was a long video. It's really good. There are many, many notes that are worth paying attention to. But he struck on two notes that I thought I should underscore myself. The first is personal. He started off his video in a way that never even occurred to me to do, which is to state his own position in terms of religion, his own religious background and whatnot. And it seems to me that if we're doing a chapter-by-chapter breakdown of a book that is an assault on organized religion, that's probably legitimate. And I don't know how many of you are new or have paid attention to the dozen or so videos that I've made on BookTube over the years. So I thought I'd start off with that. That was the first thing that he brought up, a note that he brought up that I wanted to echo in this video. And there are, of course, two sides of it, which is past and present. So in the past, I was raised, I mean, when David mentions in his video that he has an Irish last name and is from the Midwest, so of course he was raised Catholic, I tipped my cup of blood wine in sympathy. Yes, indeed. I was also raised Catholic. Went to the ceremonies, knew the Latin Mass, knew all that sort of stuff. And it didn't take me long to grow out of it. It really didn't. I didn't need, like most people who were raised Catholic need to get to college to start discarding the faith or to have it seriously challenged. And that wasn't true with me. I had discarded it long, long before I got to college. And the reason why I discarded it is the present aspect of my relationship with religion, the personal aspect, which is, of course, that it isn't true. Of course, it self-evidently isn't true. Of course, there are no gods, sprites, fairies of any kind. Of course, that isn't true. You only have to spend a little time with other species on Earth to know that that is not true. The only species on Earth that thinks that's true is the only species on Earth that can think it's true. Which, if you take a minute to think about it without doing what about and without clutching any kind of holy book or text, if you take a minute to think about that, you'll see that that is the ultimate damnation for this nonsense. It is all mythology that humans have told themselves for comfort's sake, or for momentum's sake, or for whatever's sake. It is as nonsensical to say that humans alone have stumbled on the truth of this unseen order of the universe and reality, as it is to say, I don't even know that it would be for a North Atlantic squid to somehow gain the powers of language and say, well, the key meaning of the universe is the ability to strobe electromagnetic radiation off your own skin at will. Obviously, that is the key to reality, and reality was created and is organized and supervised by the greatest ultraviolet light strober, which is why the suns emit so much ultraviolet radiation. It's why the cosmic background radiation has such a high component of ultraviolet. It's obviously, if you look at the universe and you see that we can strobe electromagnetic radiation off our skin at will, obviously that means that our Creator must be able to do that to an infinite degree, and it's reflected in His creation. Everywhere you look, there's strobing ultraviolet radiation. What kind of a fool could look at all of this and think otherwise? As a human who cannot strobe electromagnetic radiation off your skin at will, if you heard that, if you heard a giant squid say that, you would immediately see the falseness of it. Of course you would. You'd say, no, not only is that not the basis for anything, but what you're showing me doesn't prove anything. There is no such thing as a giant squid god. There are no gods of any kind. You are an animal. You are the only extant species of a group of animals, all the other members of which you extirpated. And you're the only one left, an upright thinking hominid. And in the course of your evolutionary development, which was largely favoring vocal developments, human species and proto-human species learned early on that through complex vocal coordination, they could overcome their physical deficiencies. No armor, no fangs, no claws, no speed, no strength. That they could overcome those deficiencies through language. If they could plan things through language, coordinate things far into the future through language, they would have an advantage over animals that couldn't do that. That favored the language parts of the brain, and as a pure accident of evolution over millennia, that caused the human forebrain to grow and grow and grow in size and complexity to the point where humans can now write books and contemplate philosophy and their own navels and wonder if there's a God and make up all sorts of extremely elaborate justifications for why there must be one. That's the only reason, because you are biologically equipped to be able to do that. That's all. It's the same thing as cheetahs worshiping a speed god, as falcons worshiping an eyesight god. It's the exact same thing, except humans are the only ones who are cognitively equipped to do it. No other species do, and that ought to be the lie right there. Of course there is no God. If the only people who can imagine a God are the only ones who do, then of course there is no God. There are no gods of any kind. There is no afterlife. There is no alternate unseen dimensions. When you age and die, you are gone. And it really behooves you to think that way, because it will change the way you live your life here, and that's all to the good. Anyway, so that was part one. That was the first thing that I noticed from David's video that I wanted to respond to. I was raised Irish Catholic, and long before I got to a point of disillusionment as a college undergraduate, I had spent enormous, and I mean enormous amounts of time with dogs and with pigs. Enormous amounts of time, not just seeing them or stroking them through the bars of a pen, but enormous amounts of time without any words, without any verbalization at all, so that it was just them and me, so that I got to know them and they got to know me as animals. And you don't experience something like that without walking away and saying, no. Church? Religion? Gods? Angels? Sin? No, there's no such thing. No other animal has it, and we're just animals. We invented it for ourselves. That's part number one. And I should say, concomitant with that does not cause me to scorn the religious. I'm not even really scorning religion. If the superstructure of your religion, with its doctrines of personal survival of death and an afterlife, and the personal survival through death of all of your loved ones, and maybe even a place in the afterworld where the justice that is so conspicuously lacking in this world is in fact meted out on the evil, if that gives you comfort, then that's fine. That's fine by me. I'm not scorning that at all. And also, if the moral dictates of your religion give you what feels like I'd hate to use the word crutch because it sounds like a criticism. I don't mean it that way. Crutches are, of course, entirely benevolent objects. If it gives you a bolster, a source of strength, a reservoir on which you can draw to do good in your own life, regardless of your religion. I've known lots and lots of religious people, and most of the religious people that I have known did in their lives inordinate amounts of good, disinterested good, profitless good. And most of them did it because they felt like they had this huge, invisible reservoir of strength to draw on, and that was their faith. If your faith gives you that reservoir, then I'm not criticizing that at all. Not in any way. I'm not in any way at all. I would only point out that there are plenty of people alive in the world today, in America, in the UK, all over the world, who have just that kind of unseen reservoir of faith that allows them to be better people according to a set of principles that they believe comes from that reservoir. There are lots of people in the world for whom that reservoir is the United Federation of Planets, or the Jedi Order, or Hogwarts. There are a lot of people who draw reservoirs like that from things that don't exist. I'm not against the drawing of strength. I'm not against the sublimating of those faith reservoirs to do good in your life. The only thing, and I'm not even against religion, the only thing I will not do is this nonsense that I see all over, for instance, the atheist, what's loosely termed the atheist community, of saying, well, we can't be sure. Of course we can be sure. Of course we can be sure. There are no gods. There are no gods at all. There is no afterlife. There is no supernatural. Nothing like that. There's nothing like that at all. It doesn't exist. I'm not meaning to take it away from you. If you believe in it, that's fine, especially if it helps you to be a better person. But please, there is no element of doubt here. But anyway, that was thing number one from David's video that I wanted to make sure I got on the table. I won't mention it again in these videos. And thing number two was a mention that he made of Christopher Hitchens playing dirty pool, what he calls dirty pool. I agree with that completely. That is, in my opinion, the defining characteristic of this book. And I want to sort of briefly elaborate on it. And you saw the elaborations in David's video, but for this video, I wanted to briefly elaborate that dirty pool is not when someone makes a mistake or when they argue in ignorance. It's when they know the falsity of what they're saying and they do it anyway and mold the way they're saying it so that you not only won't know the falsity, but won't guess that the falsity exists or could exist. That is dirty pool, and Hitchens did that throughout his entire life. He was a natural-born polemicist, and polemicist, that is the heart and soul of the art of the polemic, is to play dirty pool. Otherwise, it's not a polemic. And that becomes really obvious. I mean, it was, I think, obvious pretty much in the first chapter that we read, but we're reading today chapter 2 of God is Not Great, and it's called Religion Kills. And it's much more obvious in this chapter, which is longer and much meatier than the first chapter. This is a chapter I mentioned yesterday, that it is entirely possible to see passion, genuine passion instead of feigned passion, in the writing of Christopher Hitchens, and that it always has been. And you can see it in this chapter. I don't believe you can see a single bit of it anywhere in the first chapter. But in the second chapter, you do see it. And it often comes out when he is doing political wonkery. When he's analyzing politics, political developments, especially international political developments. That sort of thing brings it out in him. That's the sort of stuff he's really good at. And unfortunately, I mean, you can see the passion in this chapter because this chapter is all about that, about the various woes of institutionalized religion across the world in modern history. But even when it comes to the stuff that generates his passion, he still plays dirty pool. And he does it all throughout this chapter, where he analyzes the role that religion has played in international politics, and does so with disastrous dishonesty. Now, this is the chapter that's organized around a famous question that he was asked by the charlatan and con man, Dennis Prager. That if you're on YouTube, you will know about Dennis Prager because of something that is deceitfully called PragerU. There is no such thing as Prager University. It's a series of didactic and extremely deceitful YouTube ads that Prager has orchestrated with an enormous amount of money at his back in order to promulgate vicious alt-right stances on any number of subjects. And he has managed through a large amount of money and trolling that large amount of money on guidelines through just the lowest realms of academia to get people to make videos against their own self-interest. So you will have college professors making videos about how college professors are evil. You will have African Americans talking about how the Republican Party has always been their best friend. Things like that, which money does. But you'll know Dennis Prager's name, but this was before his Prager YouTube channel. Prager asked Hitchens a hypothetical question. Imagine that you're in a city where you don't know anyone, and nighttime is falling, and you see a group of men approaching you. Do you feel better or worse if you know that they've just come from a prayer gathering? Do you feel safer or less safe if you know that they've just come from a prayer gathering? And Hitchens was asked that question, and in his book he says the reader will see right away that this is not a yes or no question. The reader will see right away that it is, in fact, a yes or no question. But it gives Hitchens an open door to start bragging, which he loved to do. He did it whenever he could. That's why this book is so absolutely profuse with name-dropping. Good Lord. It's the number one fault that Hitchens had on a relatively unimportant level. And everyone that he knew, old friends and new, were constantly calling him on it, even in public. Stephen Fry, when they were on stage together, once joked about how, that noise you hear up here on stage will be Christopher dropping names. And Salman Rushdie did the same thing, said you're such a name dropper. And he never stopped doing it. I believe that it is one of the many things that indicates a decided rancorous inferiority complex in this author. But in this case, it's not so much personal names, although we get plenty of that in this chapter with him talking about a man whose hand I was proud to shake under fire, stuff like that. This is place names that he gets to brag and drop about, because he decides to answer Dennis Prager's question by sticking to the letter B: Baghdad, Beirut, Belfast, Bethlehem. He decides to go through 5 cities where he has been that start with the letter B, in which he's had the experience of approaching a group of men and wondering whether or not they've come from a prayer service. And the descriptions that he gives, I have been to all of the places that he describes, and the descriptions that he gives of them are mystifying. They're virtually unrecognizable, except for the contempt he has for the tawdry commercialism of Bethlehem. I don't recognize any of the other places that he's talking about. The world picture that he paints is a dystopian nightmare in which there is a handful of enlightened atheists surrounded literally everywhere on every street corner of every country and every city anywhere in the world by frothing at the mouth religious extremists who just want to kill them on the spot. That is not true. That is just not true. That does not bear any relation to reality, nor does his characterization of the religion that these people would be following. He says at one point, the level of intensity fluctuates according to time and place, but it can be stated as a truth that religion does not, and in the long run cannot, be content with its own marvelous claims and sublime assurances. It must seek to interfere with the lives of non-believers, of heretics, of adherents, of other faiths. That is not true. That simply is not true. You don't need to look any further than the epigraph of his own chapter. One of the 2 people that he quotes in the epigraph of his own chapter is Lucretius, the author of De Rerum Natura. If you traveled back in time and asked Lucretius if he was constantly being importuned by the priests of Jupiter, Optimist, and Best up on the Capitoline, he'd have said no. No, I've never been approached by anyone religious wanting me to join their sect. That's never happened. The Egyptian religions of his day didn't do it. The Assyrian religions of his day didn't do it. The Roman religions of his day didn't do it. The Greek religions of his day didn't do it. And most of the religions today don't do it. The other epigraph for this chapter is John Stuart Mill, writing about his father in his sublime autobiography. And John Stuart Mill was also not importuned by the religious in his daily life. This is this us versus them picture of the religious in this little bunkered down conclave and the anti-religious in this little bunkered down conclave, and outside slavering and scrawling at the walls like zombies are all these religious people. That's just a weird characterization. But he goes with that. Because of the rules of Dirty Pool, he goes with the rules that he has set up on the table and starts to describe various places, Beirut, Bombay, Baghdad, where he has been, and that have been, in his opinion, irretrievably marred by religion. And if you've been to these places, I read these descriptions. I read them again for this read-along. I read these descriptions and I think, aren't you leaving out a lot? And the answer is yes. When it comes to all of these horribly war-torn and strife-ridden places, he's leaving out all the factors that lead to the war and strife that aren't religious. He's just editing them out of the picture, even when he's forced to talk about them. Like, for instance, when he talks about Bosnia, a pet subject of his. He writes, elsewhere in Bosnia-Herzegovina, especially along the river Drina, whole towns were pillaged and massacred in what the Serbs themselves termed ethnic cleansing. Keep in mind, that's not religious. But anyway, in point of fact, religious cleansing would have been nearer the mark, except that it wouldn't have been. You're just saying that. That's all. Anyway, in point of fact, religious cleansing would have been nearer the mark. Slobodan Milosevic was an ex-communist bureaucrat who had mutated into a xenophobic nationalist, and his anti-Muslim crusade, which was a cover for the annexation of Bosnia to a greater Serbia, was to a large extent carried out by unofficial militia operating under his deniable control. What does that sentence say? What does it? The sentence that Hitchens was forced to write, because he might play dirty pool, but he seldom outright lies. What is that sentence saying? That Milosevic, first of all, the idea of characterizing Slobodan Milosevic as a religious fanatic. But anyway, the sentence actually says that he carried out his ethnic cleansing of Bosnia under the guise of some sort of religious cleansing, and that what it really was a massive land grab. Okay, well, if you're going to write that on the page yourself, then maybe you shouldn't characterize what happened in Bosnia as religiously motivated. And the same thing is true with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, another pet subject of Christopher Hitchens, and one on the shore of which he shipwrecked all of his friendships by taking a stance in favor of George W. Bush's preemptive war, when no thinking person could favor that war. Hitchens alone did that, and the reason he did it was not because he favored it, and not because he believed any of the arguments that he said about removing Saddam Hussein from power, and you just don't know. The minute I know that someone doesn't know anything about the subject is if they say, yeah, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, but that's when I know they don't know what they're talking about. Because you decide who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. No, the only reason that he took that position was because it's where the money was. Because he could be relied upon to get the speaking gigs from defending this thing. Because he had an ingrained urge to constantly take the contrarian position in anything, and to take it to the extreme. But anyway, Hitchens on Iraq is a subject for another day. Perhaps that'll be Hitchalong 2020. But even when it comes to Iraq, when it comes to Saddam Hussein, he has to do the same thing. He has to talk about the same thing. That Hussein only started adding religious trappings to his regime, which was not religiously founded, when he began to be called some sort of land-grubbing heretic and warmonger by Iranian clerics when he started a war with Iran, and by some of his own clerics as well. It was in response to the religious fanatics in his country calling for him to be more of a religious fanatic that he started putting on the trappings. And Hitchens actually calls them trappings, but is that good enough to vitiate his point? No, absolutely not. It is not. So you get through 2/3 of this chapter with him talking about the geopolitical ways in which religion kills, while encountering in his descriptions virtually nothing that shows you how religion kills. There are examples that he could use of people not acting opportunistically, of people actually motivated by religious zeal. There are examples that he could use. He almost never does, because he wants the ones that have the highest body count, and it just so happens they don't fit his theorem, so he has to warp his theorem a bit to make them. But at the halfway point, he turns the focus of the chapter from broad-scale politics to the personal, and starts to hit on notes that you can't ignore. The problem with Christopher Hitchens, or the glory of Christopher Hitchens, depending on how you approach the subject, is that when he's right, he's very right. And sometimes when he was right in the teeth of the whole world. And that was a wonderful thing to see. And we badly need that now. We badly need that in the world, and we don't have it from him. And of course, in the course of when he a chapter about how religion kills in the real world, not where religion suborns violence, even of a non-religious kind, of course he's going to bring up the Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa against his friend Salman Rushdie for the writing of a book, for heresy, where the Ayatollah Khomeini offered a reward of money for any faithful who would kill Salman Rushdie. This struck very close to home for Hitchens, as he said in his finer moments. That was a bringing together of all sorts of wandering points in his own mind up till that point. Here was someone in the name of religion offering money to kill a writer who was a friend of his for an act of writing a book. And that crystallized a lot for him. And that's wonderful. We get a really good passage, which I'll read to you. But before we get to that passage, we get to some awful treacle of a type that it crops up occasionally in this book and just sets my teeth on edge. This is how Hitchens describes himself. When I'm not operating as a tentative and amateur foreign correspondent, I lead a rather tranquil and orderly life, writing books and essays, teaching my students to love English literature, attending agreeable conferences of literary types, taking part in the transient arguments that arise in publishing and the academy. That isn't even remotely recognizable as a portrait of Christopher Hitchens, not even by his own lights. If you called him a tentative and amateur foreign correspondent, he'd rail against you in his next column at 3,000 words. He did not consider himself foreign and tentative as a foreign correspondent, although there was a very strong element of him being foreign and tentative. You go to Bosnia or Baghdad, lavishly bankrolled by Graydon Carter and Vanity Fair, you're going to have a very different experience than, for instance, I had in those places, or actual foreign correspondents have in those places. You're going to be assured of being whisked in, treated comfortably, and whisked back out again. So, yeah, what was it again? Tentative and amateur fits really well, but he would have bridled more than anyone if you'd used that term with him yourself. It's so false. He didn't believe that about himself, and that insufferably plummy description of his life. What was it? Attending agreeable conferences of literary types. Good Lord. That is not recognizable as anything that Hitchens ever was or did, and so it sets your teeth on edge. But even it's just a preamble, and you can ignore it. You get to the point where he talks about the fatwa, and the prose is very good. Although, again, even here, where he's being honest and heartfelt, there is dirty pool being played. He writes... in considered statements, the Vatican, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel all took a stand in sympathy with the Ayatollah. So did the Cardinal Archbishop of New York and many other lesser religious figures. While they usually managed a few words in which to deplore the resort to violence, all these men stated that the main problem raised by the publication of the Satanic Verses, that was Rushdie's book, was not murder by mercenaries, but blasphemy. Some public figures not in holy orders, such as the Marxist writer John Berger, the Tory historian Hugh Trevor Roper, and the doyen of espionage authors John le Carré, also pronounced that Rushdie was the author of his own troubles, and had brought them on himself by offending a great monotheistic religion. There seemed to be nothing fantastic to these people in the British police having to defend an Indian-born ex-Muslim citizen from a concerted campaign to take his life in the name of God. That's powerful prose, and we get a lot of that prose in this book. I shouldn't say that God is Not Great has none of that. It has quite a bit of that, but it is deeply misleading. A lot of the figures that he talks about as saying that Rushdie brought his troubles on himself were a lot more sympathetic than Hitchens describes them in this one thumbnail account. A lot of the authors that he cites and a lot of authors that he doesn't cite say only they deplore the violence, they deplore the fatwa, they deplore all of that, and they mean it. They say only that Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses in order to outrage Muslim sensibilities, the sensibilities of devout Muslims. He didn't write it and then say, oh my book, The Satanic Verses, has outraged their sensibilities, but aren't they taking things too far? He sat down at his writing table and said, how can I offend their sensibilities? And wrote that book. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Writers should be free to do that. But let's not make an innocent lamb out of this guy, okay? The Satanic Verses, in my opinion, has almost no literary merit, but the literary merit is actually beside the point. The fact is that Rushdie set out to offend these people. He set out to offend the devout Muslim world on which he had turned his back. That does not call for a fatwa, and that does not justify one if it happens. Nevertheless, the characterization here is very carefully shaded to give you the impression of an author who just wide-eyedly wandered into this thing. Why are they imposing a death sentence on little old me? And that's a little deceptive. It doesn't vitiate the point. It doesn't absolve the Ayatollah or any of the people who killed lots of people associated with Rushdie and tried to kill him and still do. But it does shade the picture a little more realistically. And you have to be on your guard against that in the course of this book because Hitchens does it all the time. And that is pretty much the big point of Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Religion Kills, is all about religion extending its arm in the real world. So we have the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. We have a brief and very self-serving digression on the September 11th massacre, in which Hitchens echoes the comments that have been made in other places in the commentariat of the day by saying that the hijackers on board the planes were by far the most religiously devout people in the world that day. Never been really sure what is helped by that observation, but I also think that it contains the seeds of a very deep insult, because it implies that you cannot be a fervently devout, that there couldn't have been fervently devout Muslims on those planes who would have fought to protect the passengers, and that's not true. Of course, there could have been. It is an unnuanced and fairly lead-handed look at the nature of religion and the nature of fanaticism, and how those two things aren't exactly the same. And that goes on throughout this chapter when we deal with Northern Ireland, when we deal with Syria and Iraq and whatnot. And that is the gist of this chapter. I want to wrap this up now. I said I wouldn't make these dissecting videos go on too long, and they have. But we're going to be free of that next time, I think, because the next chapter is very short. Chapter 3 is a short digression on the pig, or why heaven hates ham. And it's much shorter than the other chapters, so it won't take us long. I'm going to shoot for 10 minutes for that video. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. That was chapter 2 of Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great. We'll move on to chapter 3 tomorrow. Thank you, book 2.